In 1968, a group of women gathered outside the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City and threw their bras into a trash can. At least that is the story everyone knows. The phrase bra burning entered the English language that day and has stuck around for over half a century as shorthand for feminist protest. Here is the part almost nobody knows. Nobody lit a match. There was no fire permit for the boardwalk. The protesters never actually set anything ablaze, and the myth was largely manufactured by a reporter who compared the protest to burning draft cards during Vietnam. The comparison stuck. The fire did not happen. So if women in 1968 were not literally burning their bras, what exactly were they rejecting? And more importantly, what did women wear before the bra even existed to reject in the first place? That question turns out to have an answer stretching back thousands of years, and it involves a Bronze Age palace, a sealed Austrian vault, a corset tight enough to physically reshape internal organs, and a former revolutionary who built one of the first modern bras out of spite.
Today, the global lingerie industry is worth somewhere north of $90 billion a year, and it was not always true, and it was not always the goal. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a civilization that did not want to hide the chest at all. On the island of Crete, around 1600 years before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization was producing some of the most striking art and fashion of the ancient world. Wall frescoes recovered from the Palace of Knossos show elegantly dressed women in tiered skirts and tightly cinched bodices that lift the chest and frame it completely open at the front. This was not underwear hidden beneath other clothing. This was the outfit itself, worn openly at court, at festivals, in everyday palace life. Archaeologists have recovered small figurines from this period showing the same silhouette, women holding ceremonial objects dressed in garments that expose rather than conceal. Historians studying Minoan culture believe the exposed chest functioned as a marker of status and fertility rather than anything scandalous. The tighter and more elevated the bodice, the higher the social rank on display. It is a strange thing to sit with. One of the earliest fashion-forward civilizations in the historical record built an entire aesthetic around doing the opposite of what nearly every culture that followed would eventually do.
Then the pendulum swung hard in the opposite direction. By the time of classical Greece, 1,000 years or so after the Minoans, the prevailing philosophy around the female chest had flipped entirely. Greek women wore the apodesmos, a long band of wool or linen wrapped tightly across the chest and tied or pinned in place. Spartan girls trained in similar bands during athletics, and references to these breast bands turn up in some of the oldest surviving Greek literature, including comic plays where a character uses the act of loosening her band as a deliberate, provocative gesture. The goal here was not display, it was containment. A flattened, bound chest read as a respectable chest, and the idea that the female body needed active management rather than simple ornamentation took root in Western thought for the next 2,000 years. Rome inherited and expanded on this idea with more variety. Roman women had multiple garments, depending on the occasion. A snug linen wrap called the strophium for daily compression, and something closer to athletic gear for exercise. The clearest physical evidence of this comes from a mosaic floor inside the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily, dated to the early 4th century, depicting women competing in athletic events while wearing what looks almost comically like a modern two-piece swimsuit. When this mosaic was first excavated in the early 20th century, some archaeologists genuinely doubted it could be ancient because it looked too contemporary. It was real. Roman women were engineering structured garments for movement and competition, not just modesty, over 1,500 years before anyone patented anything resembling a sports bra. Mediterranean. On the other side of the world, women in Ming Dynasty China wore a diamond-shaped cloth called the dudou, designed to flatten the chest into a smoother silhouette that fit the era's aesthetic preferences. Different continent, different century, same underlying impulse. Bodies move, gravity exists, and cultures kept arriving independently at the conclusion that something needed to be done about it. What varied wildly was the why. Sometimes it was modesty, sometimes it was a specific beauty standard, sometimes, as with the Minoans, it was the opposite of concealment entirely. The instinct was universal, the execution was not. For centuries, the accepted timeline among historians was simple and, turns out, wrong. The story used to go that ancient cultures bound and wrapped. Medieval Europe skipped straight to rigid corsetry, and the structured cut bra was a clever invention of the late industrial era. Then, in 2008, construction crews renovating Lengberg Castle in the Austrian Alps broke through an old wall and found a sealed cavity that had been packed packed shut for roughly 500 years, stuffed full of discarded textile fragments used as insulation during a 15th century renovation. Among the thousands of scraps pulled from that wall were 4 pieces of linen that made textile historians do a double take because they were not breastbands or wrappings. They had distinct, separately sewn cups, a supporting band, and eyelets for lacing. The unmistakable architecture of a modern bra, dated through carbon testing to the 1400s. One piece is so structurally close to a 20th century longline bra that researchers describe the resemblance as uncanny. Medieval Europe had apparently solved the cup bra problem 5 centuries before the standard textbook timeline credited anyone with inventing. And then, for reasons historians are still piecing together, that solution largely vanished from the historical record.
What replaced it was the corset, and the person most credited with bringing it into European fashion is Catherine de' Medici, who arrived in France from Italy in the mid-1500s as the new bride of the future King Henry II. The garment she popularized was a long, rigid bodice, stiffened with a busk, a flat strip of whalebone or wood inserted down the front to eliminate any natural curve at the waist. At the French court, a 13-inch waist became something close to an enforced beauty standard, achieved by lacing corsets so tightly that ribs were compressed and internal organs were physically displaced. This was not treated as an extreme outlier practice. It was treated as the cost of looking respectable. Over the following centuries, corsets evolved with the fashions of each era, sometimes pushing the bust up dramatically, sometimes flattening it into a smooth comb. But the underlying philosophy never wavered. The natural female body, left alone, was considered a problem in need of structural correction. By the Victorian era, the practice had become a culture of its own. Tight lacing was treated almost as a competitive sport, with women trading tips through magazines about how to shrink their measurements gradually, sometimes sleeping in their corsets to train the waist down over time. Physicians of the period documented real complications, restricted breathing, displaced organs, even grooves worn into the liver from sustained pressure. Historians today are careful to separate the genuine extreme cases from the exaggerated popular myth, since most women wore corsets at far more moderate tension and lived completely ordinary, active lives. But the social pressure behind the garment was not exaggerated at all. Wearing an unlaced waist in public was treated, quite literally, as a signal of poor character. The corset was never purely about fashion. It was a daily, physical performance of respectability. Cracks started showing by the 1870s and 1880s, when a dress reform movement began organizing seriously against the corset's dominance. Groups like Britain's Rational Dress Society published pamphlets and lobbied for clothing that did not, in their words, deform the body or restrict its movement. Reform-minded writers in America described corsets as a kind of bondage that women needed to physically discard. The criticism was loud, but the corset industry had 4 centuries of cultural and commercial momentum behind it, and momentum like that does not collapse from pamphlets alone.
What actually started cracking it open was a woman with a complicated past and a pair of scissors. Hermione Cadolle was born in Paris in 1845 and spent part of her early adulthood as a committed political radical, fighting alongside fellow revolutionaries during the short-lived Paris Commune of 1871. Before being forced to flee the country when the uprising was crushed, she eventually settled into a quieter life, running a lingerie business. And in 1889, the same year the Eiffel Tower debuted over the Paris skyline, she unveiled an invention at the Universal Exposition that she had built by literally cutting a traditional corset in half. The lower portion stayed a conventional corset for the waist. The upper portion was something new entirely, a separate piece supporting the breasts with boned cups and shoulder straps instead of pushing them upward from below it. It was, structurally, the direct ancestor of the modern bra. It also flopped commercially almost immediately because fashionable women of the 1890s still wanted the dramatically cinched waist that only a full corset could deliver. Cadolle's invention was roughly 2 decades ahead of what the market was ready to buy, though it found a small, devoted clientele, including a few famous early adopters, and her lingerie house is still operating in Paris today. Around the same period, in New York, an inventor named Marie Tuchek filed a patent in 1893 for a garment she called a breast supporter, featuring separate pockets for each breast and a shaped metal plate beneath the fabric, a design that anticipated the modern push-up bra by decades. Like Cadolle's invention, it never found commercial traction and slipped into obscurity.
The version that actually broke through arrived almost by accident in 1910
courtesy of a New York socialite named Mary Phelps Jacob, who simply wanted to wear a sheer evening gown to a debutante ball without a stiff corset visibly poking through the fabric. She had her maid stitch together 2 silk handkerchiefs and a length of ribbon into a soft, lightweight garment that did the job invisibly. Friends at the party noticed immediately and wanted their own. Word spread fast enough that Jacob filed a formal patent in 1914 and briefly tried running her own small manufacturing operation before eventually selling the patent outright to the Warner Brothers Corset Company for $1,500, a deal that would go on to generate the company millions over the following decades, while Jacob herself moved on to a career in publishing. The corset's actual death blow, though, came from an entirely different direction: war. In 1970, with the United States deep into the First World War, the government's War Industries Board issued an official appeal asking American women to stop purchasing corsets because the steel and whalebone used in their construction had become strategic military resources. Women complied at a scale large enough to free up tens of thousands of tons of metal, material that quite literally went into building warships instead of waistlines. An industry that had dictated women's fashion for nearly 4 centuries collapsed within a matter of years, not because of changing taste, but because a government needed the steel more than it needed women laced into rigid garments.
What replaced the corset in the 1920s was not a return to support or lift. Flapper fashion wanted the opposite silhouette entirely, flat and boyish, and bra design followed suit, compressing rather than shaping the chest to match the look of the decade. The real structural innovation of that era came from a Russian immigrant named Ida Rosenthal, who noticed an obvious gap nobody had bothered to fix. A single standard bra simply did not fit every woman's body the same way. Working with her husband, she helped found Maidenform and pioneered the first standardized system grouping women by bust measurement, eventually evolving into the letter-based cup sizing, A through D and beyond, that the entire industry still uses today. Underwire technology emerged around the same period, in the 1930s, but did not become widely available until after the Second World War, once metal supplies for civilian use opened back up. By the 1960s, the bra had shifted from a purely practical garment into a genuine political symbol, framed by some feminist activists as just the latest tool used to police women's bodies, the philosophical descendant of the corset, wearing a softer disguise. That brings the story full circle to where this video started, the Miss America protest in 1968, where demonstrators threw bras, girdles, and other symbols of imposed femininity into what organizers called a freedom trash can. No fire, no literal burning, just a deliberate public rejection of centuries of garments designed by other people to dictate what a woman's body was supposed to look like.
Today, the conversation has moved again. Engineering for sports bras now involves serious biomechanical research into how breast tissue actually moves during exercise, a level of technical attention nobody applied a century ago. The cup sizing system Ida Rosenthal helped pioneer has expanded into far more inclusive ranges than the original 4 letters ever covered. Brands now market explicitly around comfort and body diversity rather than a single enforced silhouette. And the industry that grew out of 2 silk handkerchiefs sewn together in a Manhattan bedroom is now measured in the tens of billions of dollars worldwide. Step back far enough and the whole arc stops looking like a story about underwear and starts looking like something else entirely. It is a record of every era's answer to one recurring question: what is a woman's body supposed to look like, and who gets to decide that? The Minoans decided display was the goal. The Greeks and Romans decided containment was. Catherine de Medici's France decided rigid, painful correction was the standard for nearly 4 centuries, until a war needed the metal more than fashion needed the silhouette. Every generation was completely certain its answer was the correct and permanent one. Every generation eventually got replaced by the next with a different answer. The garments changed, the certainty never did. If this kind of history is what you're here for, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which part of this surprised you the most, because there's a lot more buried history like this still to dig into.